Hi everyone. Welcome to today's video session. I'm Kristen Alexander and this is
Josh Clausen.
And we're here to talk today about interviewing. So all the tips and tricks you need to be successful at interviewing, what works well in interviewing, and also maybe a few things that don't work so well. So we're just going to have a dialogue, talk about from the beginning to the end, and we'll take your questions in between.
Perfect.
So one of the things we wanted to start with is just the overall general etiquette of interviewing. Because while some people have been to many interviews, some people have been to less, there are different types of interviews. So what would you expect when you're heading into an interview? So I'll talk a little bit about some of the things I prepare, and then maybe Josh can talk a little bit about some of the things he prepares. We'll go back and forth. One thing I think is to...
So maybe
yeah.
let's start with what's your experience with interviews? How many have you done? Have you been on both sides of the table?
Yes. Okay. So I don't know how many interviews I've done, but it would be in the hundreds, maybe 500, kind of in that scale, because I've been working for 20 years now. Even before that, I think I've been working since I was 15 in proper jobs. So 25 years plus of interviews, and I've had all different types. I've had interviews in, working in retail stores, being a waitress and a hostess, to my first marketing jobs, product jobs. I've been in the situation where you've had to walk into an interview room and there's 5 people who are interviewing you at the same time. Interviews by your peers, interviews by your managers, interviews with the CEO. So all different types. And I've also I've conducted hundreds of interviews as well.
Amazing.
What about you?
I've personally, a few less, quite a few less. I think I've been on the interviewing side of the table probably about 30 to 40 times. You kind of lose track after a while. Everything from a restaurant in high school, going up through college jobs and so on. But on the other side of the interviewing table, doing it for a company, for new hires, I think it's north of 500. We hired a team of 70 and we accepted about 1 in 10. So north of 500 there. And
what happens with that experience is you gain a lot of tips and tricks and things that work really well, how to handle certain questions, how to handle certain experiences, to be prepared for unexpected things to happen.
Right.
And so when you're just starting out and you haven't been through hundreds of interviews, then there are some unknowns, and we want to help coach you on the unknowns and learn about those.
Yeah. We want to unveil what it's like to be on the other side of the interviewing table so that you can have a little bit more knowledge and confidence going into your first one, that it's like you've done an interview before just by learning from us. So please feel free to ask us any questions you have, and we'll address them and probably save some of those towards the end, but we're happy to answer and address any questions you have.
Awesome. So some of the things, just like standard etiquette things, you want to go into any interview confident. And so you want to, just down to your attire, you want to wear something that makes you feel confident, that isn't overly anything in any one way. So for example, I wore a navy dress today because that's like my standard attire, and I'm confident in a navy dress, black dress, like neutral colors. If you're going into a different type of interview, just something that makes you feel good, is clean, polished, presentable, whether it's female or male. And then there's a whole series of things we can talk about in terms of being prepared and knowing something about the job and the company that you're going to talk to.
Yeah. What would you say about the phrase, dress for the job you want, not the job you're interviewing for?
I love that. I actually had some coaching by a manager, maybe when I was in my second corporate job, and he said, "Hey Kristen, like you're wearing, corduroys and, t-shirts, and your hair is in a ponytail, and you look like you're 18, but you're interviewing for jobs that, you want to be a director. You need to dress for that job." Okay. So I got that advice very early, and I think that's true. You can't go wrong with dressing up a little bit.
Yeah, great. But you never want to dress too far down.
You don't want to dress too far down, because you can go wrong there, where people can't see you in the job that you're applying for. You also don't want to, wear anything if you're female that's revealing, if you're male that's revealing. You want to kind of just have a polished image. It doesn't mean you can't showcase your personality. We've talked about that a lot. Like if you wear certain types of jewelry or whatever, it doesn't mean you can't be you. But you also don't want to you want to be representative in general, I would say, of the brand that you are, the company that you're trying to get into. So if the company has a particularly edgy style or something, then you can work within that. But that's what you should pay attention to.
And you probably don't want your attire to distract from your skills.
That's right.
And you. Right.
That's right. The stories you're going to tell. So those are some things. And then you want to be prepared. You want to know about the company as much as you can learn about the people that you're going to meet, and have a really good sense of what they're looking for in the job from the job description, to the extent that you can get that information from the job description. Mm-hmm. And then, so you're going to be meeting with somebody you don't know. You want to understand before you meet with that person that you don't know, is that the person you're going to be working for? Is that the hiring manager? Is that the recruiter or somebody in HR? And some of their early questions are going to be asking you to share a bit about your story. So part of what we wanted to talk about is, how do you share some of your story? What are the types of things that you would want to have already thought through, so that you're not thinking on the fly and you're more likely to convey confidence and have a great answer because you've thought through what you want to say.
Right. And the story usually comes earlier on in the interview, right?
Yes.
And you end up telling it multiple times if you talk to multiple people?
Yes. So sometimes you'll have, one thing to keep in mind is when people are interviewing you for any kind of job, oftentimes they don't have a lot of training interviewing you. Right. So they might have read a couple of articles about interviewing, and they're following like a standard set of questions that they ask you. And so, sometimes if you go down the path of those questions, it could be very long, and you might not get to the things you want to say. So we want to encourage you to remember the things that are important for you to share about your story. I'll give a specific example. Like a lot of times, the very first question people will ask is, tell me about your experience.
Tell me a little bit about yourself.
A little bit about yourself. And it's okay to wind through your chronological experience, but if you're just talking about, well, I had this job, let's just say I had a job working retail in a retail store, I had a job cleaning houses, I had a job as a waitress, and then I started my first job in marketing. That's a chronological experience, but it's not as compelling as sharing your story from a skills perspective. Right. So one of the things we want to encourage you to do is think about the skills you acquired in each of those jobs and use those as the basis for your story.
And insert a little bit of your personality and a tiny bit of your upbringing, right?
Yes. If I tell just a chronological story of the work experience I've had, that's pretty boring, I think. Right. But if I talk about, well, I had this job, I started as an entry-level marketer, and in my first marketing job, what I did was learn about our customer base. I learned everything about them, and I built customer segmentation. So we knew there were 3 types of customers that we had, and I built the databases to support those and all of the marketing around that. That's much more interesting than just talking about I had a marketing job, I was a marketing analyst, then I had a product manager job, for example.
Yeah. It also shows some of the skills that you picked up and your abilities and what you can bring to this new company and team.
Exactly. So one good thing to think about is in each of the jobs you've had, regardless of what types of jobs they've been, what are the skills that you've acquired in those jobs that you can list out? And then how do you build a story around those skills? And there's a framework for building these stories called SOAR. Do you want to talk about the SOAR framework?
Sure. Yeah, this is it's kind of like an acronym or like a cheat sheet to telling one of these stories on the fly. It stands for situation, objective, action, and results. So long story short, you just want to be able to convey, I learned this skill while I was in this situation. The objective was this. I did specifically these actions that led to this result, whether good or bad. So if you leave out any one of those parts, the story won't be complete, and you'll leave the listener wondering if the results were good, or did you actually take the action to make the results as you said they were? So you do need to hit all those parts, and you can do whatever flavor you want. So I guess we could do an example of a source story.
Sure.
How about I ask you a question? What's
Okay.
a time, tell me about a time that you needed to market a product and it wasn't working and you turned it around.
So a good example would be at the very beginning of my career, I had to work on marketing text messaging, and the value proposition around text messaging was that you can communicate faster with everybody, and also it was free. But when we started talking about text messaging, we were just talking about the technology of text messaging and less about the value proposition. So my objective was to increase adoption of text messaging by talking more about the value proposition, and by tying text messaging to emotional benefit of friends connecting with each other and being able to connect to more friends because it was more economical than calling on the phone, for example, we're able to actually drive higher adoption of text messaging. So I think that's a really good example of a source story where you're fighting with a technology to get consumer adoption.
Beautiful. So you hit all the different points, the situation, objective, action, and results. And I understand now exactly what you did and what happened, and I can ask you follow-up questions from there and we can keep going.
Yes. And also, if you have that framework in your head, that enables you to think on the fly a little bit better, right?
It's like a puzzle. It enables you to put the puzzle together, and maybe you have to buy a little bit of time. Maybe you repeat the question as you... And we were talking the other day about tips and tricks for buying time as you think. One good one is to make sure you understand the question, to repeat it back. A situation where I needed to turn around marketing for a product was, and I just bought myself 15 seconds to then go through the steps of the source story and answer. And maybe I only have the S and the O figured out and I still need to finalize the A and the R.
Yes.
But you can do it as you start to go through the story.
That's a really good tip. And you can, repeating the question is a really good idea. And anything else, like, I don't know if you noticed, I think I said something like, well, early in my career, and when I said that, I was buying time to think about what I wanted to say because I hadn't prepared the answer for that. So any little thing like that you can do to gather your thoughts is really helpful when you're answering questions. Another thing is to know going into any interview, now that it's been years that I've been interviewing, I have a bunch of stories cataloged in my mind that I can refer to and pull up. It's a good idea to have at least 3 of those. So you want to make those list of skills and then understand in any conversation you're having with anyone about a job, can you tie a story around each of those skills so you always have 3 stories ready to go and you can use them multi-purpose to answer almost any type of interview question.
So what if I don't have 20 years of experience. I've only worked in a restaurant as a server and also at a retail store as a checker. How could I get the material to piece together some of these stories?
Well, I would start by thinking about the things you do that are skills in your day-to-day life of your job. So let's take the retail example. I work with people. I provide customer service. I organize inventory and present inventory in a way that is merchandising, which can be used in many different types of jobs. I troubleshoot and problem solve. Those are similar things that I'm doing working with customers. I'm probably handling some, checking customers out, using different software to handle that. Point of sale software, any of the technical things you're doing. And then from that list of your day-to-day tasks, you can narrow in on the 3 skills of that big list that are most applicable for the job you're talking to.
Yeah. And I think one of the good things to do is to think about the day that everything seemed to go wrong. I think that where you had somebody that was really upset, whether it was a customer or like the system broke down. A lot of times those make for the best stories because the day, the show must go on. You have to keep customers going in and out. You have to keep serving food. And you do things in this time, even if you don't know that you did, to help things continue moving on. And so that's ultimately what makes for the best stories, especially when you get the, what was a difficult situation, how do you turn it around? Think of those like very hard days, and then from there, do exactly what Kristen said and extract out the skills and the actions you took and the results, and you'll be in a good place.
Also, if you're willing to share a story that shows a little bit of vulnerability, or, I was faced with this really challenging situation and I overcame that challenging situation, that builds a connection with the person that you're talking to, because they're naturally going to feel empathy for you. Yeah. So it shows you're human and you have some, humility in sharing that story, and it makes for a really great relationship builder.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So think through what those stories are, and you can share those stories for questions like, what are your greatest strengths? Tell me about the experience you have and how it relates to this job. Any of those job-related questions, you can insert those stories, and you have a really great place to work from. Now, in the case of these standard I was talking before about how sometimes people don't have a lot of interviewing skills, and so they have like a standard list of questions that they're going for. One of those questions is often something challenging around, what is your greatest weakness, or tell me about a time at work that you failed, or tell me, about something you're not great at. And how do you answer those questions?
Well, maybe let's start with what we shouldn't do. We shouldn't say, I never show up on time.
Yes.
We all have our days, but you shouldn't showcase a very negative weakness. I think the best way, so there's two sides of this coin. If you explain that you have a weakness and that you're not doing anything about it, that shows further weakness, because you're just looking at a problem and not fixing it. And then somebody can assume that in turn you probably wouldn't be the best employee. Mm-hmm. So if you do state, what's the trick? You state a strength as a weakness sometimes. Maybe yes. I pay too much attention to detail, and that keeps me from, zooming out and seeing the big picture. And I've adopted a new process of interacting with my colleagues when I feel like I might be doing this, to check myself. Am I thinking about this correctly? Is there something else we should be working on? And in doing so, you do recognize that you have a tendency to do something, and that you have a system in place to get better at it. And that tells an employer that you're pensive, you're looking internally, what can I do better? And you're always improving. That's
right. So the tip there is to take a strength that you know is a strength and turn that strength into your weakness as well. And you can even say that, I've said that before, which is, while I am, a really great driver of projects, and I'm able to execute things really well, that can turn into a weakness as well if I'm doing that without seeking collaboration and getting everybody on board, and I'm just executing and not bringing people into the fold. So you can take any skill of yours that is a strength, share that it's a weakness, and do what Josh said, which is to make sure that you have a system for how you handle that weakness. So in my example, I always, make sure, because I know this is a strength and a weakness, to slow down, make sure that I am, bringing the right key stakeholders on board, those types of things where you show that you're aware of it and you take time to check in and make sure it's not becoming an issue.
Perfect. What would you say is the next most common difficult question that people ask?
Other difficult questions, I think, are sometimes very specific, like explain how your experience directly relates to this job. Right. And so if you have those stories, you can twist them to relate to the job. It also requires, though, that you really have a good understanding of the tasks of the job and what you're going to be doing most. And if you have to think on the fly to answer that question and you don't already have your stories prepared, that's a lot harder to do.
Yeah.
I think it's also, sometimes you'll get challenging people.
Yeah.
And then the challenging people make the questions more challenging. So you could take that question to another extreme, which is somebody would say to you very directly, it doesn't seem to me like you really have the experience that fits exactly to this job. Tell me why you do. And then all of a sudden they're kind of putting you back in a little bit of a defensive position that you have to overcome. So I also find that just having those stories is helpful. And then another thing to think about, which I think would be a good topic to talk about, is just your whole framework of thinking going into an interview. That could be a very challenging question if this is, the job of your life that you really want, that you need from an income perspective, et cetera. But if you shift your thinking a little bit in how you approach interviews, that can help calm you down to answer a question like that without getting anxiety.
Okay. So I guess let's work through what frame of mind should we be in going into a critical interview. And then after that, maybe let's touch on when you get that rapid fire questioning, the very direct, the difficult personality, the person that's going out of their way to throw you off. How do we deal with that?
Mm-hmm. So I think one just super helpful thing to think about interviewing, and it took me a long time to get to this place where I really think about interviewing as meeting people, having conversations with people, just like you would at a party or anywhere else you are in life. And it's practicing meeting new people, having a great conversation. It's practicing talking about yourself. So the more you think about it as something you're going to accomplish for yourself and less about somebody interrogating you, it seems to make it easier to get through that conversation without putting so much pressure on it.
Right. And would you say that's somewhat similar to like a first date?
Totally. I think it's very similar in a lot of the things that we've talked about in terms of making a good first impression. You still want to showcase your personality, but not so much that you're, alienating the person that you're meeting with. And also you want to, you're having that sharing back and forth. So a first date is
right.
a lot about, I'm going to share a little bit about me and I'm going to get to know a little bit about you and you're going to share. And also the other thing about,
see if it's a good fit, right?
See if it's a good fit, but also like a first date too, you are, you're going out of your way to build a connection.
Yeah.
So you're being complimentary to each other, and that's another great tactic, I think, in interviews. If you can be complimentary to the other person, even if you give a compliment right in the beginning to kind of share some goodwill, you're likely to tip the conversation a little bit in your favor for the rest of the time. So it can be simple things like, the example I have readily to mind is not a great one, but it's like, it can be very simple, like, I love what you're wearing, you look great. In a respectful way, not in so that's where you have to be a little bit careful. Or, I was so excited to meet with you today because I read that, I read your article on XYZ. Perfect. Or, something that just shows you did a little research. I think that helps, ease everything.
Yeah. Okay, so we were on frame of mind, which is one of maybe more of a first date, doing it for yourself. Also that it may be practice. Mm-hmm. So are there any tips and tricks that you have the day of the interview that you go through to remind yourself of these things? Because we all have those little things that we do to help ourselves calm down. Do you have any that you can share with the group?
Sure. I think I'd like to know for the job that I'm talking about. And I guess this goes both ways, but I'll talk about as a person interviewing. I like to know for the job that I'm going to talk about that I know the key skills or the key stories from my experience that I want to make sure I highlight. And if I just have that kind of quick list in my head, like 3 things I want to make sure I say, I feel pretty comfortable. I like to do a little bit of research, so I definitely want to know about the people that I'm meeting so that I am not asking questions I don't need to waste time on. A good example would be if I were meeting with somebody and I asked the question just right out of the gate, what do you do? and I had
Right,
access to find that information, I'm taking up time on that question. So it's better if I know a little bit about them and what they do, to the extent that that information is available. Sometimes it will be, sometimes it won't be. So I like to do that and like to know a little bit about the company. And there's one other thing. I like to have thought through at least one good idea for the company that I would be recommending in the job that I would be taking. And we could talk about that a little bit. And that makes me comfortable. And then I try not to overthink it, because that stresses me out. So just like right before I'd go into an interview, I would probably, not think about it too much, so that I wasn't getting my anxiety up. And then the other thing we've talked about that's anxiety inducing is being late. So I always try to make sure I have enough buffer.
Right. And for those that have just joined, if you have any questions, feel free to write them out on either Instagram or YouTube Live, and we'll work it into the conversation and make it interactive. So following that, is it good to come prepared with questions?
Yes. Outstanding practice.
And what happens if I don't ask questions?
I think if you don't ask questions...
Because most interviewers ask, do you have any questions at the end, right?
If you don't ask questions, I think the interviewer often walks away thinking you're just not that interested, that you really didn't care about that job enough to think through the smart questions you want to know. Because it's kind of your one opportunity to learn about the company, learn about the people.
Yeah.
You almost need to have a question.
So is it a good practice to just always have at least a few planned out?
Definitely. A couple of questions, probably 3, at least 3.
Okay. So I guess I'll walk through my day of the interview framework. I'm not as polished as Kristen. I do still get very nervous, sometimes anxious, maybe anxious right now, who knows. But that's something that I deal with, and I know that I deal with it. So I do take a number of steps to make sure that I'm getting myself in the right place at the right time. One is being early. If I'm ever pushing the timeline, that does stress me out more, which isn't productive. It's not
productive.
Not productful. Productive.
Yeah.
There's the nervousness coming out. So I make sure that I'm early, and I also make sure that I've done a lot of the same things that Kristen has done. I know what's going on in the job. I've talked to everybody I know that may be connected to the company, to make sure I have a good idea of what to expect. And past that, I do tell myself that it is practice. I do tell myself that it's just a conversation, and that it's a two-way conversation particularly. And I do take a number of measures to make sure that I'm presenting myself professionally inside the room as well. Stand up, look in the eyes, shake the person's hand. Especially when you get nervous, it's easy to not do these things, especially, look them in the eyes as you shake their hand. And when you sit down, have a tall presence. Try to not pick your fingernails or have the leg thump or any of those things. So I do kind of actively tell myself throughout, like, make sure you don't do these, be engaged in the conversation, and ultimately focus on learning. How much can I learn about this position? Because it is a relationship here.
Yes.
In a job for a while, ideally.
Right. And then there are different personality styles, I guess. I'm more extroverted, and when I get nervous, I talk a lot, probably. And then other personality types might be more quiet,
right,
which can be an advantage, because all the time, if you feel more quiet and you're listening, that gives you time to ask great questions. So one of your strengths is you ask great questions. And so that can be a strategy in interviewing as well, is to take the time to not only have some questions prepared, but really listen to the person you're talking with in a conversation, and think of those next great questions that you can ask. And that does a lot to build a relationship.
Yeah. And there is an art to it. So what you want to make sure not to do, and we've been covering a couple of these things, is you don't want the interviewer to feel like they're being interviewed.
Sure.
So you can go too far with this.
Sure.
If you're rapid fire asking questions, and you're not actually listening, you're not actually keeping the conversation going and flowing and allowing them to ask their questions and have their time to speak, that's actually a very negative sign. So that's and you have to push the threshold pretty far, but that's something you want to make sure not to do, which is interview the interviewer. But do have a few questions, and respectfully and casually in conversation, ask them to
Yes.
keep the conversation flowing naturally.
Yes, and sometimes that just loosens up. If you're getting asked questions and you're talking a lot, and even sometimes if you need a break, like asking a question is a good trick to just like give yourself a mental break to listen, and then you can start responding again.
Absolutely. So what's a good way to deal with a very difficult personality that comes out rapid fire, asking questions, very direct, seems like they don't want you in the room? What's your frame of dealing with that and turning it around and making it productive?
I think it's hard to address this across all types of people because there's many different types of people, but there's a couple of tactics you could try. So if somebody is being very difficult, you can give them an answer you think is right in their sweet spot or something that they really enjoy doing. So I'll give an example. I'm in marketing. I've worked in marketing traditionally, and I have to work with sales as a stakeholder. So when I'm talking to somebody in sales, I always put my answers in terms of revenue and things that are interesting to them, or say something like, I know in sales, this part of your job is really, really difficult. So if you just acknowledge something difficult about what they have to accomplish or give a compliment, that's a type of a compliment. I'm saying that I understand your job is really difficult and I'm trying to work with you in this job. I'd be working with you to help that a little bit. That's like a type of compliment. If you could do a type of compliment, a little bit of empathy for their job, if you could break it up with a little bit of humor, which is tricky because you have to read that situation and know that the humor is actually going to work. But those are tips to kind of just diffuse the conversation a little bit. You can also just be genuine and say, you can even almost pause the conversation and say, I'm really excited to be here today. I've been preparing for this job for a number of years with the skills I've been acquiring, and it's just exciting to be having this conversation. Any kind of compliment like that is going to move things more in your direction.
Okay. It seems like it might be hard in the moment
It's hard in the moment.
When you're getting the rapid fire, to calm down and construct that.
I think it is.
Maybe it comes with experience.
I think so. But that's a good way to think about when you've had practice and you practice in your conversations, sharing more about yourself, it becomes easier to have these tricks that you can use kind of right in the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So what next?
What are some of the other things that we could talk about that would be helpful from interviewing? One thing is that you want to make sure that the conversation, we talked a lot about, okay, person's going to be asking you questions, you're going to be responding. It's great if you can ask a few questions to learn more about the job. One of the most important questions you can ask is what your day in the life at a job is going to be like. So, and you want to kind of ask this question if you can. Obviously, you've done your research and you read about the job, but a trick I like to use is usually in the first third of any interview, someone's going to ask me, do you understand what's involved in this job? Do you understand what the work will be in this job? Some question like that. And the way I like to answer that question is, yes, I've read the job description. I've done a bunch of research on the company, and I've researched you. But I would love to hear in your words what a day in the life of this job is like.
Right.
And that way, you're building a relationship with that exact person you're talking to and understanding their perspective on what your job would be like.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's hard to tell sometimes what you'll actually be doing. If you look at a job description, there's, sometimes hundreds of these bullet points.
Yeah.
And there's no way you're doing them all on the same day. So a lot of times you do one thing more than the other. And so it really helps for you to make a wise decision on what to do for your next job, to get the inside scoop on what a day in the life of that job looks like. I think another great question that's easy to just remember and have in the back of your mind is, what does success in this position look like? And so what that does is it says, it brands you, it portrays you as a person that not only wants to do the job, but wants to excel at the job. And after that, you also learn what really is important. So success may not be, for example, getting there 15 minutes early every day, but maybe it is, being on time, but then also being very thoughtful and communicative with your customers.
Mm-hmm.
It gives you an inside scoop again to what the manager or that employee that you're talking to really cares about, and how, if you do get the job, how you can get in and at least work on that one or two things to become successful really fast. And it also tells you what they care about. So if you don't necessarily agree with what they said success looks like, maybe it showcases a part of the job you don't want. Or maybe it further affirms that, yes, this is the right job for you.
Absolutely. That is an excellent question. I think just those two questions alone, if you start with those two questions and add them to your interviews, that goes a long way in sort of understanding what the job is about and showing that you care. Because hiring decisions are really important. The person who's hiring you might only have a few opportunities. This might be the only job they're hiring for this year. It could be just a couple of opportunities they have to hire. Right. And they want to know that you care about this job, and you're not just going through some routine because you need a job, but you actually want this particular job. I think that's the most important thing, is they want to know that you want this particular job, that you've done your research on it, and you can make a story where your skills match to this job, and there's a compelling reason why they should hire you, not everybody else.
And I think those are the people that end up getting hired the most, are the ones that are very catered towards that specific position, from everything from the resume to cover letter to your presence. The less generic, the more specific, and then add in some passion is, I think, a very good recipe for landing the job.
Exactly. I remember when I worked at Disney for a period of time, and they asked that question in particular. A lot of big companies will do this, and a lot of smaller companies will do this too, because they want to know you want to work there. This is their lives. They're often, small businesses are somebody's life's work, putting that together. And so they ask at Disney very commonly, tell me about your experiences with Disney and why you love the Disney brand. And you know going in that you have to be able to answer this question. And I remember telling a story about, I had lots of stories because I loved Disney from a kid on to this day, but I remember being very specific. I made a point to be specific about the fact that my mom wore like Mickey Mouse earrings and like things like that. Any little personal anecdotes that you can add in that apply to the job, not just for the sake of storytelling, but they actually answer a question and apply to the job and show why you care. That is a really good approach as well, because it makes you human and it makes you a great fit.
Absolutely. I think a lot of like consumer type companies, so let's say a clothing company or a company that makes a product, a lot of times they do ask a question around, do you use our product?
Right.
Do you enjoy our product? Restaurants will do the same. Clothing stores will do the same. And it's because there's an underlying secret, which is if you yourself love the product and you get excited about it, that's going to showcase to the customers. And it doesn't matter if you're in a sales type position or not, that the joy in the product and working there, it speaks for itself. And a lot of times it encourages customers to enjoy the shop or the restaurant or the product as well.
That brings up another question, which oftentimes people ask, which is, why are you the perfect person for this job?
Right.
And so you want to be able to showcase your skills, of course, your work skills that apply to the job, because that's really important. But you do want to have this more personal element, that this is a restaurant that you've been going to since you were a child and it means something to you. Right. Or any way to tie in to the company that you're applying for, why this is a great fit for you, really goes a long way to build that relationship.
Absolutely. So we only have a couple more minutes.
Okay.
Are there any last topics we want to touch on?
What about post-interview? What do you do?
Oh, great question. I actually did. So I didn't know this until I want to say I was 22. No one told me, wasn't brought up in any class. Family didn't know either. There is something you're supposed to do after the interview. And what's that?
Send a thank you note.
To who?
Right. All the people actually that you've met with.
Okay.
And there's two ways to do it. I mean, I'm sure there's multiple ways, but you can, send an email, which is what I do, and I think that's sufficient. Some people, though, do send handwritten notes, like a card, so that requires more work. You need to make sure that you have the right address of where that person is and that you know that the mail will actually get there. But you want to have a couple elements in that thank you note, and you want to do it right away.
Okay. So it's 2019. Are we sending letters in the mail?
Some people are sending letters in the mail.
Okay.
But
What
most people are sending emails, and
Okay.
I send email, and I think that's great.
And so what's a good way to get those emails? Because it's not like, you sit down at the table, all right, what's your email? Because you need to send a thank you letter.
Well, what you can do is you can actually ask for your email. So I've had people ask me just directly, can I have your email?
Okay.
So that's okay. You can ask for their email, especially if you don't, you might already have it if there is a calendar invite. If you don't, you can look on the website for the email. You can ask somebody else in the company if you don't want to ask that person. Like if there is an office manager, for example, you could ask for the email. And you just want it to be short and sweet. This doesn't have to be a book of why you should join the job. That's probably overkill. But you just basically want to say, thank you so much for meeting with me. I really appreciate you taking time out of your schedule. I'm really excited about this job, and here are a few reasons why. I can lend my skills here and here, and I'm really looking forward to either continuing the conversation, the next steps, something that's coming next that indicates a little bit of confidence on your part that you're really hopeful that this is going to get to the next step.
Right. And I think a good practice too is to say one thing that you enjoyed about your conversation with that person specifically.
Yes. That would be great practice.
Yeah.
And something not to do, though, is to be too overly, you don't want to be too overly eager, right? Like, I've wanted this job my whole entire life, and I can't wait to start tomorrow would be too much.
So is 30 seconds after you walk out of the door too soon?
Too soon. Too soon, I think.
Is 3 weeks later
too late? Too late.
Okay.
So
what's the happy medium?
So I think happy medium is next day, always safe on next day.
Okay.
Some people do send it that evening if you had like a daytime job, but I would say next day is like a perfect amount of time.
Beautiful. Okay. Well, I think that's about all the time we have.
All right.
Thank you guys that was fun. Thank you guys for joining. And this will be up on both Instagram and our website for you guys to reference. And feel free to ask us any questions anytime. You know where to reach us, aux.work.
Thanks.
Thanks.